Chapter 1. The Manor of Sorrow was not named for its tragedies, but for the chilling, deep-seated melancholy that clung to its stone, a spectral moss on the ancient memory of the land. It stood as a skeletal monolith against a sky the color of old bruises, high on the peaks of the Carpathian Divide, a sentinel guarding nothing but its own dust and the perpetual, biting wind. Inside, Lord Cassian Thorne, the oldest of the unbroken line, moved through chambers vast and marble cold, a creature forged by millennia of regret and powerful, silent observation. He was solitude personified, an aesthetic tragedy in tailored velvet and skin like polished ivory. His eyes, a striking, unsettling shade of liquid gold, reflecting the flickering candlelight but holding none of its warmth. His life was an elaborate penance, a covenant of self-imposed isolation broken only by the duties of his terrible crown. The guilt, a constant low thrum beneath his powerful chest, was the true architecture of his existence. He ruled a kingdom of midnight, yet lived in a solitary cell of his own making, utterly alone. The thought was a comfortless anchor. Tonight, the heavy oak doors, barred and secured by ancient silver-etched wards, shuddered under the sudden, frantic assault of a human panics he had not heard in 200 years. A woman, alone, desperate. The noise was raw, an utterly unschooled plea against the high, formal silence of his domain. He paused in the grand library, a towering vault of forbidden lore, the scent of dust and aged parchment momentarily eclipsed by the sharper metallic tang of cold fear. A profound disruption. He had sworn the covenant of isolation, a blood oath to the old world to leave humanity to its fleeting dramas, but the sound, an elemental cry for refuge, was a dagger to the carefully cultivated stillness of his soul. He moved then, not with the languid grace of the predator, but with the sudden, liquid efficiency of a man called back from a long, self-imposed exile. Every fiber of his being, every icy drop of his ancient blood, screamed a protest against this intrusion, a dangerous breaking of the peace. Yet the deep, resonating memory of a similar, unanswered cry, one that haunted his darkest hours, drove him forward. He descended the grand, winding staircase, a shadow within shadows, the very air around him growing heavier, colder, saturated with an immense, unspoken authority. The sheer force of his presence seemed to push back against the raw panic trying to breach his walls. At the gate, she was a frantic silhouette, frail and trembling against the ironwork, her breath clouding the frigid air in sharp, desperate gasps. He drew the great bolt, the sound echoing like a single gunshot in the quiet night, and stepped out onto the threshold, moonlight turning his features to chiseled marble. Evelina Vane was small, cloaked in travel-stained wool that did little to conceal the tension coiling her body, and her face, even drawn taut, with fear, possessed a severe, almost painful beauty. Her eyes, a startling deep sapphire, met his with a kind of fierce, unblinking conviction that belied her terror. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much and yet still sought to see more, perhaps even a reflection of her own fate in the gaze of a being who was a living myth. She did not beg. Her voice, when it came, was a low, melodic tremor, formal despite the circumstances, a desperate oath in itself. "Lord Thorne," she whispered, leaning into the ward line, as if the very air near him offered a sanctuary of ice and dread, "I require a covenant. I require sanctuary." She pronounced the word with a terrible weight, knowing exactly what she was asking. Not a simple hiding place, but the invocation of an ancient, binding law between species, a political and magical act with consequences reaching back to the first night. "I beg of the king to hide me from my husband." Her words were stark, direct, and devastating. The simplicity of her request, a domestic plea wrapped in the language of high stakes, supernatural politics, made Cassian recoil internally. A husband, a mortal drama. It was mundane, yet the sheer audacity, the clarity of her conviction, held him utterly still. His silence was immense, a heavy drape of ancient power. He could feel the pulse in her neck, a frantic, vibrant flutter, a tempting, irresistible rhythm that spoke of a brief, warm life he had long since forfeited. He inhaled the scent of her. Surprisingly, not just blood and fear, but a strange, sharp undertone of smoke, and something indefinably other, something like the ozone after a lightning strike, catching his attention. It was the scent of power, untamed and perhaps even unaware of itself. The sudden, unsettling awareness that this was not merely a runaway wife, but a catalyst, slammed into him. "Sanctuary," he finally rumbled, his voice like stones rolling in a deep chasm, "is not merely a gesture, mortal. It is an oath of blood, an act of war against any who claim you. What is the value of your life that I should risk the covenant for a domestic dispute?" He watched her, waiting for the inevitable crack, the collapse into tears or hysteria. But her back remained straight, her sapphire eyes locked on his golden ones, fiercely protective of the secret she was hoarding. "The price," she said, her breath catching only slightly, "is my life, Lord, and the life of what I carry. He seeks not merely to control me, but to extinguish us. We are the anchor. I am the key to a truth he cannot possess, a key that must be kept safe until the blood moon." Her hand instinctively went to her abdomen, a subtle, fiercely protective movement that confirmed the stakes. A child, a prophetic child. Cassian felt the earth shift beneath his feet. The silence returned, more charged, more dangerous than before. This was not a domestic dispute. This was a direct challenge to the ancient balance, a threat to the fragile peace his kind had bled centuries to establish. The high stakes, the sheer, devastating burden of her secret, instantly resonated with his own self-hatred and guilt. He saw not a woman, but a vessel, a fragile life holding a world-ending choice. And in her fierce, isolated terror, he saw a mirror of his own lonely burden. He hated the pull, the inevitable, dark magnetism of duty. He was a creature of ice and eternity, and she was warmth and a ticking clock. Yet the sheer depth of her belief, the desperate hope in her eyes, appealed to the solitary, powerful mercy he kept locked away. He closed his eyes for a long moment, the decision a crushing weight of centuries. Let the peace burn. "Enter, then," he commanded, opening the gates just wide enough. "But know this, hostess, you have not found a refuge. You have found a cage, and the keeper is a king whose mercy is as cold and as sharp as any blade. You are under my shield, and I will not permit the taking of a life so fiercely protected, not even by the husband you claim." He stepped back, allowing her to cross the threshold, the very air seeming to snap shut behind her. The sanctuary was given. The war had begun. Chapter 2. Evelina stepped across the silver-etched line and into the Lord's domain, the shift in atmosphere immediate and absolute. It was not merely the cold of the mountain air, it was a profound, supernatural stillness that settled over her, chilling her blood but silencing the frantic, drumming fear in her mind. The wards, she could feel them, not as walls of light, but as immense sleeping presences woven into the marble and stone, waiting to awaken and defend. She stood, winded, in the grand foyers, surrounded by the ghosts of power and forgotten history, facing the most terrifyingly beautiful man she had ever seen. He was, quite literally, a legend made flesh, and the sheer antiquity of his being was a physical weight in the air. Cassian watched her, his expression unreadable, a study in motionless, lethal grace. The high-stakes vulnerability she had displayed at the gate was now replaced by a quiet, determined defiance, a palpable conviction that she had made the only possible choice. She did not look around in awe or terror, but met his gaze directly, a small, fierce pulse beating steadily in her neck, a rhythm he found dangerously captivating. He could smell the cold, the faint, metallic scent of the road, and beneath it, that other fragrance, a kind of clean, sharp energy that spoke of untamed, latent power. It was the scent of a nascent key, and it confirmed his worst fears and most compelling, hidden hopes. "Your husband," Cassian began, his voice dropping to a low, intimate tenor that vibrated through the silent hall, "must be a fool of monumental proportions to force such a gem from his keeping. Name him. Be precise, for the covenant requires clarity. It is not merely a name I need, but the truth of his claim upon you, and what he seeks to extinguish." He guided her, with a mere gesture of his hand, deeper into the manor, into a smaller, adjacent parlor, warmed by a grand, reluctantly blazing hearth. The firelight danced across his sharp, perfect cheekbones, emphasizing the unnatural smoothness of his skin, the impossible stillness of his body. He did not move. He seemed simply to exist, an anchor in the flow of time. Evelina accepted the silent offer of the hearth's warmth, though she kept a respectful, tense distance. The formality of her bearing was impressive. She treated him not as a monster, but as the king he was, a terrifyingly dangerous political entity. "His name is Lord Lysander Vane," she stated, her voice regaining its melody, but laced now with a metallic edge of profound hatred. "He is, or was, a highly placed scholar of the Order of the Sanguine Dawn. His claim is one of ancient marriage contract and biological imperative. He seeks the child, not the life. He seeks to harvest the prophecy inherent in its bloodline, Lord, the blood moon anchor. I am not merely a woman, Lord Thorn. I am the culmination of a bloodline he has sought to control for 3 generations." She paused, her eyes flickering to the fire, as if watching the flames consume her last chance at a normal life. "Lysander Vane believes that the child, if born under the approaching blood moon, will be the key to unlocking a specific, forbidden nexus of power, a power he intends to use to bridge the veil permanently, flooding this world with what he calls the forgotten kin. The covenant is threatened, Lord, not by the mundane, but by a mortal madman using ancient knowledge to achieve a supernatural goal." Her explanation was sparse, purposeful, and damning. The forgotten kin. It was a term from the darkest, most feared passages of the old lore, a name that spoke of creatures outside the established supernatural hierarchy, beings that consumed light and order. Cassian felt a cold dread, a recognition of an old, buried truth. The burden of his crown had suddenly become immensely heavier. "Lysander Vane," he repeated, the name tasting like ash on his tongue. "The scholars, always the scholars, dissecting the mysteries they cannot comprehend. You speak of the blood moon anchor, a myth, a legend of the time of the first sun." He fixed his golden gaze upon her, his tone now one of clinical, terrifying skepticism. "Convince me, Hostess, do not rely on old wives' tales and cryptic phrasing. What proof do you carry that your child's bloodline is worth a war?" Evelina did not flinch. She slowly, deliberately pulled aside the heavy wool cloak at her neck, revealing a thin, almost invisible seam in her ivory skin, running from her collarbone down beneath the high neckline of her dress. It was a scar, impossibly fine, perfectly straight, and around it, when she focused, the air seemed to shimmer faintly, a low, electrical hum audible only to him. "This," she said, her fingers tracing the line with a quiet, devastating reverence, "is the mark of the Cainite binding, Lysander's proof of claim. Every firstborn female in my line has carried it for 2,000 years, a curse passed down from the prophetess who first spoke the anchor's truth. It is not a scar, Lord, it is a key, a living map etched by an ancient, forbidden covenant, indicating the child's potential. He branded me to prove to his order that I was his property, his instrument. He believes the power is in me, But it is not. It is only through me. The intimacy of the revelation, the quiet, terrible vulnerability of her showing him this deep, physical wound, struck him more profoundly than any shouted threat. She had willingly exposed her deepest shame and her deadliest asset. The stillness of the room was broken only by the crackle of the fire, its light doing little to dispel the profound darkness of the covenant they were forging. Cassian felt the fierce, protective instinct, an emotion he had believed long dead, stir violently in his cold breast. The sight of the scar, a sign of her immense inherited burden, resonated with the deep-seated guilt of his own ancient violence. He was not a savior. He was a shield, and a shield he would be. "You are under the mantle of thorn," he stated, his voice a final, unshakable declaration. "Go to your rest, hostess. You are safe from Vane's touch, but you are not free. You belong to the protection of this house, and you will not leave its grounds until the threat is extinguished. I will summon the Council of the Blood, and we shall prepare for war. The anchor will not be extinguished. The choice will remain yours, no matter the cost." Chapter 3. The following days were saturated with a tense, oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional low-voiced pronouncement from Cassian's private study, where ancient maps were spread and strategies for an invisible war were being meticulously drawn. Evelina was housed in a remote wing of the manor, a luxurious prison overlooking the skeletal branches of the ancient Carpathian forest. The contrast between the cold, Gothic grandeur and her own profound internal turmoil was stark. She was alone, isolated, yet paradoxically, she had never felt safer. Cassian, the terrifying king of the night, was her only shield, a truth that carried its own terrifying weight. She saw him rarely, in the long, echoing dining hall during meals she only pretended to eat, or briefly in the library as he sought out specific, leather-bound tomes whose contents were clearly too dark for mortal eyes. In these moments, their dialogue remained sparse, focused, a measured exchange of high-value information. There was no attempt at comfort, no false intimacy, only a terrifying, formal respect between two individuals burdened by a world-altering destiny. One evening, she found him by the window of the Grand Gallery, looking out over the endless, shadowed peaks, his stillness so absolute he could have been a statue carved from the ice. The moonlight caught the sharp, perfect profile of his face, illuminating the profound melancholy that seemed etched into the very structure of his being. He looked less like a ruler and more like a permanent sentinel, condemned to watch the world turn without him. The air was charged with unspoken history. "Lord Thorn," she began softly, breaking the enormous silence with measured care. He did not turn, but she felt his immediate, absolute focus shift entirely to her, a sensation akin to a powerful, cold hand closing around her core. "Hostess Vane," he returned, his voice a deep, quiet resonance. "I had hoped you were resting. The burden of an unwanted covenant is heavy enough without the anxieties of a new war." "Rest is a luxury I cannot afford," she replied, moving closer until she stood a respectable distance behind him, her gaze also fixed on the unforgiving landscape. "The burden of the anchor is that it demands choice, Lord, and I need to understand the true nature of the protection you have offered. You are a king. Your mercy cannot be without a price." He turned then, slowly, his golden eyes fixing on hers with an intense, unnerving clarity. They were eyes that had witnessed the birth and death of empires, and they seemed to see straight into the fragile, fiercely beating core of her determination. "Everything has a price, hostess," he agreed, the words quiet yet infinitely powerful. "The price of my protection is my oath. It is a terrible thing, that oath. It means I will tear the world apart before I permit Vane to breach these walls and take what is mine to shelter. It means I will commit acts of violence that will stain the very history you seek to preserve. It means you may watch me become the monster the legends claim I am." He took a single, slow step toward her. "And the price of the covenant is your trust. unquestioning and absolute. If Vane is as clever as you claim, he will try to fracture that bond. He will speak of my nature, of the blood I require to sustain this defense, of the darkness inherent in my soul. Do not listen. For the duration of the siege, I am your shield, nothing more, nothing less. Your life is my absolute mission. His honesty, stark and brutal, was more intimate than any gentle word could have been. It was a declaration of fierce, protective intent, stripped bare of all romantic pretense, framed only by duty and the crushing weight of his ancient guilt. She understood then. He was fighting not just for the child, but for the chance to redeem a past failure, a past life he could not save. I accept the price, Evelina stated, her voice steady, unwavering. I am not naive, Lord Thorne. I have lived under the threat of a cruel, manipulative power for years. I know what monstrous things look like. You look like strength, cold and terrible, but not cruelty. Lysander Vane's cruelty is the kind that smiles, that uses love as a chain. Yours, I suspect, is merely the consequence of your nature. I choose the sharp mercy of a king over the soft tyranny of a husband. She raised her hand, a small yet profoundly significant gesture, and placed her palm flat against the cool, rough marble of the wall. This house is my anchor now. I trust your oath, Lord. I trust that you will not permit the prophecy to be manipulated, for its corruption will be a judgment on all your kind. The sheer conviction in her sapphire eyes was a force that even Cassian could not ignore. He looked at her hand on the cold marble, then back to her face. She was not a victim seeking comfort, but a warrior seeking a fortress. He was captivated by her power, the power of immense conviction, the rarest and most dangerous power of all. The council has been summoned, he stated, stepping back, the moment of dangerous intimacy passing instantly, replaced by his kingly reserve. They will arrive at dawn. Be prepared, hostess. The political theater of my kind is far more dangerous than any simple battle. You will be questioned, scrutinized, and measured. You will speak the truth, and you will not falter. Your role is not passive. You are the catalyst, and you must hold your truth like a weapon. He gave her a sharp, definitive nod, a silent dismissal, and turned back to the window. The immense, melancholy silence returned, deeper now, yet laced with a palpable tension, the quiet before a storm of supernatural politics and inevitable violence. Chapter 4. The dawn brought no light, only a thicker, more pervasive gloom, and the arrival of the Council of the Blood, a cabal of the oldest, most powerful vampire elders, each one a walking monument to cold ambition and ancient law. They appeared as shadows given form, cloaked in silks the color of deep night, their movements utterly silent, their combined presence freezing the already cold air of the grand hall into a palpable layer of political ice. Cassian stood at the head of the great obsidian table, a figure of commanding, uncompromising authority, his golden eyes hard and utterly without compromise. He had shed the velvet of the scholar and now wore the sharp, tailored severity of a military king, a stark declaration of his intent. Evelina was brought forward, standing alone on the polished black floor, a small island of warm, vibrant life against an ocean of cold, calculating power. She wore a plain, dark gown that emphasized the delicate severity of her features and the fierce resolve in her sapphire eyes. She was the hostess, the key, and the primary witness in this impromptu court of ancient law. The questions came like surgical strikes, delivered in low, formal voices laced with centuries of skepticism. Lord Darien, an elder whose face was a beautiful, severe mask, leaned forward, his voice a silken, dangerous thread. Hostess Vane, you seek to fracture a legal, mortal bond and invoke the covenant of sanctuary, a contract reserved for the protection of direct and undeniable supernatural threats. Your husband, Lysander Vane, is a human scholar. Explain to this council why we should risk the fragile peace for a domestic dispute. no matter how emotionally charged. Evelina stood her ground, her voice clear, melodic, and entirely devoid of fear, a deliberate act of immense will. Lord Darien, you misunderstand the nature of the threat. Lysander Vane may be mortal, but his knowledge is supernatural, and his ambition is to destroy the very balance Cassian's line swore to uphold. He does not seek me or a simple child. He seeks the blood moon anchor, the power that exists through me, residing in the potential of my unborn child. He intends to use this power not to rule, but to unmake the veil entirely, summoning the forgotten kin from the ether. His act is not domestic. It is an act of treason against the natural order, one which will unleash creatures that prey on your kind as readily as mine. Her use of the ancient terminology was precise and deliberate, signaling that she was not a desperate runaway, but a well-informed protagonist in this supernatural drama. She had been coached by Cassian, not in lies, but in the devastating weight of the truth. A ripple of cold interest moved through the council. The forgotten kin, a threat that transcended the petty politics of their rule. Lady Isolde, a stunning figure in blood-red silk whose gaze was as sharp and cold as a winter morning, posed the next question, her tone laced with suspicion. You speak of prophecy and anchors, abstract concepts. Lord Thorn, your king, has offered a shield based on your word. We require physical proof of the Cainite binding. Show us the mark of the Old Covenant Hostess that we may verify the severity of the threat. The request was a violation of all propriety, an assault on her bodily autonomy, but it was necessary. Evelina met Lady Isolde's eyes. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she pulled open the closure of her dark gown, exposing the thin, precise line of the ancient scar on her collarbone, the only part of the mark visible above the fabric. The air in the room seemed to momentarily thin, and a faint, almost imperceptible silver light pulsed just beneath the fine line of the scar. Cassian watched the scene, his jaw clenched, his golden eyes radiating a dangerous, contained fury. He hated this required exposure, this raw display of her burden, but he knew it was the only way to silence the political opposition. The mark spoke louder than any words. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the weight of ancient recognition. Lady Isolde inhaled sharply, her own eyes widening slightly in genuine, cold surprise. Lord Theron, the quietest of the group, broke the silence with a single guttural word in an archaic tongue. Veritas. Truth. The mark was undeniable. Cassian chose this moment to intervene, his voice cutting across the room like a shard of ice, drawing all attention back to the source of power. The proof is before you. The covenant has been invoked with cause. The hostess and the anchor are under my direct personal protection by the right of my crown and the law of the ancestors. Any attempt to question, remove, or compromise their safety will be treated as an act of war against my entire line. This is not a vote, my lords and ladies. It is a declaration. Lysander Vane and the Order of the Sanguine Dawn have been placed on the Blood King's blacklist. Our forces will move to sever his connections, dismantle his network, and contain the threat before the blood moon rises. He did not ask for their allegiance. He commanded their compliance. The sheer force of his will, rooted in the undeniable truth of the anchor, was absolute. The council members exchanged quick, calculating glances, assessing the political fallout. They had come to challenge, but were faced with an inescapable reality. The threat was genuine, and the king's commitment was absolute. They could not afford a war over an already sanctified sanctuary. The meeting concluded not with an agreement, but with a series of cold, formal nods. The shadows of the council departed as silently as they came, leaving behind an atmosphere heavier with the reality of war. Evelina stood straight, but the energy of the confrontation had drained her. Cassian approached her, his gold eyes softer now, though still intense. You did well, Hostess, he said, his voice a low commendation. You have anchored the truth with grace and immense courage. Now the battle is mine to fight. Your task remains unchanged. Rest and prepare. You are the eye of the storm. Do not permit your will to waver. He extended a hand, not a gesture of comfort, but a firm, formal offer of support to lead her from the hall. For the first time, Evelina saw past the king and the monster and saw the man burdened by an immense, terrible duty. She placed her hand in his, feeling the unnatural cold of his skin and the powerful, unyielding strength of his grip. The contact was intimate, high stakes, and filled with a silent, mutual understanding of the profound solitude of their respective burdens. Chapter 5. The siege began not with a battering ram, but with the insidious creep of whispers, magically amplified lies woven into the mortal political fabric and the fragile hierarchy of the undead. Lysander Vane was demonstrating his true power, the ability to turn allies into enemies through the subtle manipulation of ancient fears and selfish desires. Reports filtered back to Cassian's study through guarded channels. Vital supply lines to the manor were inexplicably blocked. Minor vampire houses who had sworn fealty were retracting their oaths, and the mortal press was suddenly awash in beautifully worded, damning rumors about the king's madness and his dangerous obsession with a human woman's prophetic child. Vane was clever, using the politics of the past to hamstring the defenses of the present. Cassian watched the slow-motion destruction of his external power base with a cold, contained fury, every new report a fresh layer of guilt and isolation settling upon his already burdened soul. He knew this was the price of his choice, the inevitable consequence of breaking his long, self-imposed isolation. He spent his days in a feverish cycle of counter-strategy, his nights pacing the high parapets, a figure of solitary power outlined against the indifferent moon. He could sustain the wards and the physical protection indefinitely, but the political war was one he was not accustomed to fighting. His kingdom was one of absolute authority, not popular consensus. Evelina, sensing the immense strain and the rising isolation of her protector, began to spend her evenings in the Grand Library, claiming she needed the vast obscure tomes for research into the forgotten kin and the nature of the blood moon anchor. In truth, she sought simply to break the oppressive solitude of his labor, offering not advice, but a quiet, fiercely protective presence. One evening, she found him standing before a massive, leather-bound map of the territories, his hand pressed flat against a contested region, his marble-like skin glowing faintly in the candlelight. The exhaustion in his posture was the most human thing she had yet seen about him. "He seeks to isolate you, Lord," she stated quietly, without preamble, "to starve the fortress from the outside in. The whispers are his most potent weapon, for they appeal to the ancient fear of your kind, the fear of exposure, the fear of the mortal world finally understanding its own power." Cassian did not turn, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease fractionally at the sound of her voice. "He understands my fundamental weakness, Hostess," he admitted, his voice low, intimate, a deep rumble of self-hatred. "My isolation was always a lie. It was a penance, but it was also a strategy. I cannot rule if I must constantly defend myself from my own kind's petty ambitions. Every resource spent on a political battle is a resource diverted from the true defense. I am alone in this, as I have always been." He finally turned, his golden eyes shadowed with an immense, ancient melancholy. "Tell me, Hostess, in your world, when all alliances crumble, what is the core of your defense?" Evelina walked to the table, her gaze sweeping over the archaic, detailed map, a world that was suddenly, terribly real. She looked up at him, her sapphire eyes holding a fierce, uncompromising conviction that was both beautiful and terrifying. "The core of my defense," she said, her voice dropping to a potent whisper, "is the truth of the threat, Lord, and the anchor of an unbreakable oath. You are relying on politics. You need to rely on the ancient law that governs both your kind and his ambition. You must find the covenant that binds him, and you must use the threat of the forgotten kin to force the wavering houses to choose between their petty gains and their own survival. She paused, then added the intimate human element that cut through his royal reserve. And you must stop bearing the entirety of the burden, Lord. You are not alone. I am the reason this war is being fought. I am ready to be your voice, your sword if necessary. I am the key, but I am also the witness. The declaration was a fierce, high-stakes declaration of intent. It was a shared burden, acknowledged openly for the first time. Cassian stared at her, utterly still, the unspoken word of her loyalty hanging heavy in the air. She was offering him not her life, but her will, a force far more valuable and rare. He felt a profound shift in the architecture of his isolation. The cold shell around his heart fractured slightly, allowing a rush of something sharp, warm, and terrifyingly close to hope. The covenant of the vein line is contained in the sealed scrolls of the first blood oath, he rumbled, his voice thick with a sudden new resolve. A scroll I have always refused to open, for its power is a terrible one. But you are right, we must use the law itself as our shield. He walked toward his desk, but stopped halfway, turning back to her. The scrolls are in the deepest vault, warded by a spell of self-loathing. Only the touch of one driven by a profound, ancient guilt can retrieve them without triggering the protective curse. He looked down at his own hands, marble pale and unnaturally still. It has been 2,000 years, Hostess. I had hoped never to face that particular darkness again. Evelina walked toward him, crossing the final dangerous distance between them, and laid her small, warm hand over his own cold, large one. The contact was a shock, a profound violation of his solitude, yet utterly grounding. Then we retrieve them together, Lord, she said, her eyes never leaving his. We face your guilt together. For the anchor to hold, the king and the key must be in absolute accord. The touch was a covenant more potent than any blood oath. It was a fierce, terrifying intimacy forged in the furnace of shared, high-stakes survival. Chapter 6. The deepest vault of the Manor of Sorrow was not a treasure chamber, but a library of the damned, a circular stone room where forbidden knowledge and the severed threads of ancient magic were kept in perpetual darkness. The air was thick, oppressive, tasting of cold iron and forgotten oaths. The ward of self-loathing was not a visible barrier, but a psychic weight, a profound, personalized projection of the deepest, most corrosive regrets of all who sought to enter. It was a cold, constant reminder of every failure, every violent choice, every life sacrificed. As they descended the spiraling stone steps, Evelina felt the insidious creep of the ward, a phantom chill that whispered of her own trauma, her fears of being inadequate, of failing the life she carried. She pressed closer to Cassian, whose stillness was the only anchor in this psychic turbulence. Cassian, however, was a master conductor of his own inner darkness. His face was a mask of utter, perfect composure, but Evelina could feel the immense, crushing weight of the ward converging on him, seeking the heart of his ancient guilt, the memory of a choice made millennia ago that had cost him his humanity and his first, deepest love. It was a torrent of sorrow and violence, a wave of pure, concentrated self-hatred that would have driven any mortal to madness. He walked through it as if it were a physical blizzard, his eyes fixed only on the central plinth where the sealed scroll lay. The scroll itself was protected by a final, physical barrier, a shield of solidified light that burned with the heat of 1,000 dying stars. This shield, the etheric seal, would only yield to the touch of two hands, one of ancient, powerful unlife, and one of true, nascent prophecy, the king and the Hostess. They stopped before the plinth, the oppressive atmosphere making every breath a conscious effort. Cassian looked down at Evelina, his gold eyes blazing with an intense, unvarnished emotion that was terrifying in its depth. "This is the final test, Hostess," he breathed, his voice a low, rough sound against the ward's silent scream. "If your conviction is not absolute, if the power of the anchor is not yet strong enough, the seal will consume us both." He reached out his marble-pale hand, placing it flat upon the searing light of the etheric seal. The light flared violently, but did not burn him. It merely intensified, wrapping around his hand like liquid fire. "Place your hand upon mine. Do not hesitate." Evelina met his gaze, saw the absolute trust and the fierce protective duty in his eyes. There was no terror in her heart, only the immense guiding force of conviction, the knowledge that this was the only choice, the only path to the child's survival and the world's safety. She laid her small, warm hand directly over his own. The instant their skin met, a catastrophic fusion of power erupted. The etheric seal did not shatter, it simply vanished. A massive surge of raw energy slammed into them, but instead of damaging them, it stabilized, flowing through the mark of the canite binding on her skin and back into Cassian's ancient, immense power source, an electrifying acknowledgement of their symbiotic purpose. A profound, echoing resonance filled the vault, the sound of an ancient law yielding to a new, high-stakes covenant. The shield was gone. Cassian's hand, still covered by hers, reached out and grasped the sealed scroll, the first blood oath. It was an ordinary object, parchment wrapped around wood, yet it held the destructive power of a forgotten god. He pulled it free, and the oppressive psychic ward in the vault instantly dissipated, the guilt and the self-loathing retreating, defeated. They stood in the sudden, liberating silence, still touching, their breaths coming in quick, shallow gasps. The silence was the most intimate thing of all. Cassian slowly turned his hand, their palms still pressed together, and his thumb gently, accidentally, brushed the delicate skin of her inner wrist. The movement was small, yet profound, a flicker of something dangerously human and immensely powerful. He looked at her, his expression a complicated mix of awe, relief, and a terrifying nascent protectiveness that was rapidly overriding his long-cultivated reserve. "The anchor holds," he murmured, his voice a low, deep tremor. "The choice is secured, Hostess. The covenant of Vane is now ours to break. Lysander will face the wrath of the law, and he will not prevail." He slowly, reluctantly, pulled his hand away, the cold returning instantly, but the ghost of her warmth lingered. "Let us ascend. The war now moves from defense to offense. We shall read the law, and then we shall strike." They left the vault, the first blood oath clutched in Cassian's hand, two solitary figures walking into the light of the manor, bound by a dangerous, terrible covenant, the vampire king and the hostess who carried the world's survival in her womb, their burdens finally, irrevocably shared.